In the mid-1950s, the international system was locked in a standoff. Two superpowers dominated the globe, grinding against each other and forcing the rest of the world to align with either Washington or Moscow. For newly decolonized nations across Africa and Asia, this presented a trap. They had finally secured political freedom, but without economic independence from their former colonizers, true sovereignty was impossible to achieve. In 1955, leaders from 29 African and Asian nations gathered in Indonesia for the Bandung Conference. They laid out a radical third path. Their strategy was South-South cooperation. By trading directly with one another and pooling their resources to build joint manufacturing, they planned to break their structural dependency on the global North. 70 years later, that objective appears wildly successful. Annual merchandise trade between Asia and Africa has exploded from under $1 billion in 1955 to roughly $500 billion today. But researchers, including Prof. Jean-Claude have run an empirical audit on those numbers, questioning the true nature of this massive trade volume. Did the Global South actually achieve the economic equality promised at Bandung, or did these billions simply build a new machine of dependency? The political ambitions of 1955 sat largely dormant for decades. It took until the late 20th century for those ideas to translate into structured economic policy. The first major wave of modern, institutionalized South-South outreach began in 1993, when Japan launched TICAD, an international conference focused specifically on African development. Then, in 2000, China launched the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. When FOCAC was elevated to a head-of-state summit in 2006, it triggered a massive acceleration in economic engagement across the continent. FOCAC's model prompted parallel initiatives, like the India-Africa Forum Summit, which launched to capture a share of this parabolic growth. These Asian-led frameworks successfully solved the scale problem of Bandung. Today, roughly 80% of all Asia-Africa merchandise trade flows through just two bilateral corridors, China and India. To understand how these corridors actually function, we need to conduct a forensic economic audit of the goods moving across them. Looking at the product composition data, Africa remains overwhelmingly a commodity exporter. About 80% of all its exports to Asia consist of primary goods like raw minerals and oil. In return, Africa is importing goods of increasing technological sophistication from Asia, moving away from basic textiles and buying electronics, machinery, and vehicles. This co-integration analysis reveals a stark mathematical imbalance. For every 1% increase in African exports to China, imports increase by 1.68. This ratio mathematically compounds, leaving China with a $62 billion trade surplus in 2024 alone. This maps weighted eigenvector centrality, measuring how trade volume and network connections translate into structural power. Over 2 decades, China achieved a 0.98 score, indicating near-total systemic dominance over the African economic network. The data confirms what we called the Bandung paradox. The immense trade volume succeeded, but the vision of equality failed. The old North-South dependencies have simply been replaced by an asymmetric East-South hierarchy, heavily optimized for resource extraction. Stepping away from these Asian partnerships isn't a viable option. Instead, the rules of engagement must be rewritten. The most powerful tool for this recalibration is the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA. By integrating 49 disparate nations into a single cohesive internal trading bloc, the continent generates the leverage needed to negotiate on equal footing. This internal leverage allows African leaders to demand the original terms outlined in 1955, mandatory technology transfers and joint industrialization taking place inside African borders. The old model of exporting raw minerals has to end. The new model requires refining those materials locally, creating high-value components that serve both regional markets and global supply chains. Maintaining economic sovereignty also requires a multipolar strategy. African nations must cultivate relationships with multiple Asian partners simultaneously to ensure no single entity can ever maintain a 0.98 stranglehold over the network. The $500 billion trade scale proves the economic potential of the Global South, but the true spirit of the 1955 Bandung Conference will only be realized when that immense volume is paired with genuine, balanced co-development.